In this module, as you can see, we are studying poetry, and we are going to look at certain set forms used in poetry. We're going to look at deviations from those forms. We are going to look at what to do when analyzing a poem, what to look out for, how to answer questions on poetry, etc. Now, the first form that we are going to study is the sonnet form. And the first thing to remember about the sonnet is that a poem with 14 lines is not necessarily a sonnet. There are other things that sonnet needs in order to make it a sonnet. Now we're going to look at two very basic forms, the most traditional forms, and these are the forms that you must understand and that you must really try and memorize and make your own. Okay? Now the first one is the Petrarchan sonnet. We're going to look at that one. And opposed to that, the Elizabethan. The Petrarchan form is the older form. It's also called the Italian sonnet. And the Elizabethan one is also called the Shakespearean sonnet. And that is obviously a later form, changed by Shakespeare. And there were reasons why he changed the form, but not that right now. We're going to look at the forms and see how they are similar and how they differ. Now, the Petrarchan or the Elizabethan sonnet obviously has its 14 lines, as the Elizabethan will have its 14 lines. That's a given, right? Both should be written, or both of these forms are traditionally written in iambic pentameter. You must have heard about the iambic pentameter. It is the rhythm that goes ta 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 ta. Iambic pentameter means that there are 10 feet and 5 stressed syllables. So now we get to the differences between the two sonnet forms. And the first thing I'd like to say, and that you need to understand, is the one aspect that distinguishes the Petrarchan form is what they call bipartite, the bipartite format. In other words, you have an octave consisting of 2 quatrains, which is clearly distinguished from the sestet, which is the remaining 6 lines, and those then are 2 tercets. And there's a clear separation between the two. Sometimes in the octave you'll get say an argument, and in the sestet a reaction to the argument. Perhaps in the octave a happening, an event, and in the sestet a reflection upon the event. But there's always the turning point, which we also call the volta. So basically it is an octave, 8 lines, sestet, 6 lines, and with a very definite rhyme pattern. It's interlaced rhyme here. You've got A, B, B, A in the first quatrain, A, B, B, A in the second quatrain, making up the first 8 lines. Then you get the volta. It's also called a caesura, or a long pause before the sestet starts, and the sestet has 2 tercets, which goes like this: C, D, E, C, D, E, or C, D, C, C, D, C. And so we can call the octave perhaps the statement, and we can call the sestet the answer to the statement. But most importantly, you must remember about the Petrarchan sonnet is that it's in two parts, the statement and the answer to the statement, or the reaction. Petrarchan, Italian, started by Petrarch in ancient times. Now we've got the I said that was also, that is Italian, yes. So now we've got the Elizabethan sonnet, which is started during the Renaissance, and mainly by Shakespeare, but there were many others also that wrote sonnets at the time, and it was an altered form of the Petrarchan sonnet altogether. It's mainly because of the inflection of the two languages. It was sort of easier in English to get more rhyming words because of inflections. So, also written in iambic pentameter, as we said. In those two aspects, they are the same, and that they have 14 lines. But now, what do we have in the Elizabethan? We've got 3 quatrains. So we have 4, 8, 12 lines. 1, 2, 3 quatrains, and then we have a rhyming couplet. So you can see that the structure is totally different. So we've got A, B, A, B, first quatrain. C, D, C, D, second quatrain. E, F, E, F, third quatrain. And then we've got the rhyming couplet, which is G, G. I call the Elizabethan sonnet my GG format because it ends in the GG. So you can see how in the Elizabethan there are more rhyming words, and it's because of the nature of the language, which is different from the Latin. Fine? Now, how does it work? It's not like the statement and the reflection about the statement. It is 3 quatrains. It is usually an argument in 1, 2, 3 parts. One aspect, then the second aspect, then the third aspect. And then, of course, then you've got the GG, where everything comes together in a clinching conclusion. The argument is concluded. Not always in Shakespearean sonnets a logical conclusion to what you've heard before, but the poet's clinch to his argument. This is what I say about the 3 aspects I've mentioned before. This is how I see the conclusion. So this is an argument in 3 parts, and then the clinching in the rhyming couplet. So can you see how the 2 differ? As an example of the Petrarchan sonnet, we are going to give you Composed Upon Westminster Bridge by William Wordsworth. And it is a poem. It's basically just a reflective poem. It's a description of the River Thames and London. Can you see London with all its buildings and so on? In the early mornings, as he stood on Westminster Bridge, he observed something. Right. So remember I said it's Petrarchan. So you're going to have the bipartite, the octave sestet. Right. So you're going to find in the octave a description of what he sees. You can imagine it's early morning. He's standing on the bridge, the Westminster Bridge, and he's looking over the Thames at the boats. He's looking at London. He's looking at the buildings. And it's early morning and beautiful. The sun is just rising. So the first part is just a description of the city. Now, William Wordsworth was said to say about poetry in general that, as far as he's concerned, it's recollections that he then in tranquility makes poetry about. So he sees something, and then when he's tranquil, when he's quiet, when he's still, he reflects upon what he has seen, and then he writes a poem about it. So very apt here then will be that there's this volta after the description of what he has observed, and then there's the volta, and after the description then a reflection upon what he has observed. Now, once you remember that, already you're going to understand half of the poem, right? So this is the octave. Now listen to his description of London. Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth, like a garment, wear the beauty of the morning, silent, bare. Ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples lie open to the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. So you can see this description. There's a lot of imagery going on here. I'm not going to dwell upon that right now. You can have a look at the rhyme scheme. You're going to see it fits. So, but the point is that here he is giving this description, and he is focusing on the beauty of the city in the morning. The air is smokeless, that there is no pollution there. The ships that are normally busy, they're chartered and they're doing this and that and the other, they're quiet right now. The city is quiet, and the buildings. If you think of all those buildings and the things that are going on inside every day, people doing things, there's nothing like that. So everything is lying open to the fields and to the sky. In other words, open to nature and the influence of nature rather than man-made things. You can go and look at that by yourself. And then, of course, we've got the volta, the long pause, the caesura. And now we have the reflection. And this is how he feels now in tranquility. He thinks about this. And he says, never. Look at the hyperbole. You can have a look at all those aspects of poetry later. But never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor. To him, he has never seen anything this beautiful. Valley, rock, or hill, never saw I. Can you see the eye, the reflection? Never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. In other words, there's no invasion of human activities, at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. What I wanted you to see is the clear bipartite structure, and that this is a typical example of a Petrarchan sonnet. Fine. Now we're going to go to the Elizabethan sonnet, which, as I said, was made popular by William Shakespeare in the Elizabethan times during the Renaissance. And we're going to look at, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, which is sonnet 18, and it's one of the best known sonnets that Shakespeare wrote. He actually wrote 154 sonnets, of which 126 were dedicated to William Herbert, who was the Earl of Pembroke, which could have been one of his patrons. A beautiful young man. They were dedicated to this beautiful young man, young boy, sometimes called boy, but a young man. And then, of course, there were 28 dedicated to the Dark Lady, one of which, of course, is the one about the my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. She has these black wires growing on her head, and she's not beautiful at all. She's not like the picture that she should be. that is one of the 28 dedicated to the Dark Lady, which could have been perhaps his mistress. We don't know. So remember, we said 3 quatrains in a kind of argument. We're not going to do a perfect analysis of the sonnet. We're looking at the structure. And we've got the A, B, A, B. You can see it here. A, B, A, B. And it follows, sorry, that looks terrible. It follows that correct rhyme scheme, etc. It's a perfect example of his sonnets. So we've got the first quatrain, where he says now, okay, asks this rhetorical question, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? What shall I compare you to? You are so beautiful. Now remember, for instance, it's not South Africa. The sun is not, so frequently seen there. So shall I compare thee to a summer's day, which is so beautiful, full of sun and flowers and so forth? But he says, now you are more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So in other words, summer's too short, and it is too intemperate to be like you. You are better. Can you see how he says, I want to compare you to a summer's day, which is one of the best things ever, but you are better. Then he goes on to the next quatrain, in the next part of his argument, if you like, in what he wants to convey to this person, to the Earl of Pembroke. He says, I'm going to explain to you why also you are better, because sometimes in summer, sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines. Sometimes it's too hot. Sometimes the gold complexion is dimmed, it becomes overcast. And every fair from fair sometime declines. So in other words, beauty must somehow die. The most beautiful rose must decline and die, right? So, because nature does it to them. So therefore, you are better. So can you see the kind of argument that he says? I want to compare you, but you are better, and more reason why you are better. And then it goes on, and he says, there is a slight change in perspective here, but he goes on with his argument. He says, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. He has a kind of inverted personification used here. In other words, that instead of that, the person is compared to summer is compared to the person. In other words, a person has a summer, right? And you have an eternal summer. In other words, your summer will not fade. And he's clearly working up to a kind of conclusion here. And he says, and it will also not lose possession of the fair thou owest. You are too beautiful. You will not become ugly like the rose that has faded and died. Your fairness will stay forever. Nor shall death brag. Death will not brag and say, I'm going to take this person, because you will never die. Like nature, things in nature will die. And nor shall death thou wanderest in his shade. In other words, you're not going to be in the shade of death. When in eternal lines thou growest, you will grow in eternal lines. There's punning there that you can go and think about, but we're not analyzing right now. This is the third part of the argument. Not only are you better than summer, but you are also not going to die. You are not like summer at all. Summer's going to die, but you not. And then he clinches. He gets to his rhyming couplet. Can you see there? Is your GG. He says, you will live forever. Why? Because of me. And that's typical of Shakespeare, where he brings himself into the rhyming couplet. I will take all transience away from you. I will make you live forever. How? Because as long as men can breathe, like you and I are now breathing, and what are we doing? We're reading a Shakespearean sonnet, and we're reading that the Earl of Pembroke was much more beautiful and more temperate than summer, and you will never die. Why not? Because I am still breathing, I'm still reading, I the reader, and eyes can see, as long as that happens, there are people who can breathe and read. So long lives this. In other words, lives this poem, and this poem gives life to thee. It is going to make you immortal, because we have now just met the Earl of Pembroke after all these years. There's, I suppose, a bit of truth in that, but it's quite an arrogant statement, but that's typical of Shakespeare, typical of his Gigi's, that he makes this arrogant, clenching, final statement in a rhyming couplet. That then concludes our lesson on the sonnet form, especially then firstly the Petrarchan and then the Shakespearean, and how they differ. Until next time.